Today's webinar will include a brief introduction about Qcdc and our distinguished guests. Then we will move to a discussion for approximately 35 minutes. And lastly, we will dedicate around 20 minutes to answer your questions at the end. Before closing the event, we will provide you with an event survey. Please take the time to fill out the survey at the end of the presentation, as your opinion is of much value to us. So to begin, allow me to tell you a little bit about our organization. Qatar Career Development Center is a member of Qatar Foundation under the Community Development Division, with a mission to empower Qatar's youth to respond to the requirements of the Qatar National Vision 2030 by instilling career guidance within Qatar's socio-economic culture. Qcdc supports students to better plan their career paths in line with their potential and the future needs of Qatar's labor market. It also equips parents and career practitioners with career guidance knowledge and information needed so they may best advise and guide the students. Qcdc also aims to enrich and support career guidance policy making and practices by contributing to quality career literature, insights, and consulting, as well as offering high-quality career services by professional experts. I would now like to turn it over to my colleague, Ms. Efrosini, who will introduce our esteemed panel guests.
Well, thank you so much, Paige, and welcome, a warm welcome to everyone, and also to our special guests. On behalf of the Qatar Career Development Center, it is with great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Temple Grandin and Dr. Stephen Shore to our first event for the Autism Awareness Month in Qcdc. There are a lot of things I can say about both our guests. Because of time constraints, I'll just stick to the short bio. And first with Dr. Temple Grandin. She is well known to many for her trailblazing work as a spokesperson for people with autism, as well as her lifelong work with animal behavior. Dr. Gradin has been with Colorado State University for over 25 years, and she has been referred to as the most famous person working at CSU by her peers, and one of the 100 most influential people by Times Magazine. Her life's work has been to understand her own autistic mind and to share that knowledge with the world, aiding in the treatment of individuals with a condition. Her understanding of the human mind has aided her in her work with animal behavior, and she is one of the most respected experts in both autism and animal behavior in the world. And also about Stephen Shore, although non-speaking and recommended for institutionalization with the support of his parents and now his wife, Dr. Shore is a professor of special education at Adelphi University, focusing on improving the lives of autistic individuals. Stephen often talks about his 4 A's of autism, which is awareness, acceptance, appreciation, and action. And our past, present, and future efforts on awareness builds a solid foundation for us to accept and work with the characteristics of autism in education. Also, finding suitable employment and including people on the autism spectrum in the fabric of society is one of the foundations that we can appreciate contributions of people, of neurodiverse people to society. I'm glad to report that the Qatar Career Development Center is engaged in much action in collaboration with Dr. Shore and others to make fulfilling and productive lives for people on the autism spectrum the rule rather than the exception. And with this being said, we're going to dive now into our discussion points. And I would like to start the discussion with one important video. And we will start building on that.
I don't know that I want to hear from any more experts.
Will you please let me finish? With intensive psychotherapy, an autistic child can be treated.
The report plainly shows that autism is not a psychological problem.
I am not familiar with the Rimland report.
Calm down, sweetie. Sweetie, calm down.
It would be better if you could get her to sit calmly. You're trying to control her.
What are you talking about?
But we were told self-stimming is good. It eventually calms them.
Self-stimming? Yes, self-comforting.
Self-stimulation, rocking, spinning, rolling on the floor,
Oh,
flapping.
I think spinning is good. And rolling, too. Self-stimulation does seem to eventually calm the nervous system. it can be a way to compensate for not being held. And being held by another person is scary, but rolling or being held by surfaces produces the calming effect that ordinary children get from a hug.
How old's your child?
Well, I don't have children. No, I'm autistic. And I need the sensation of being hugged. And I've developed a machine that I get into and hugs me, and I'm different afterwards. I'm more social. Well, I didn't speak until I was 4. Now I have a BA and a master's, and I'm studying for my doctorate.
How did you learn to speak?
Please don't shout. Please don't shout.
Most autistic people are very sensitive to sounds and colors. Overstimulation hurts. You know, people talking too much at once, can cause us to panic.
How did you get cured?
Well, I'm not cured. I'll always be autistic. My mother refused to believe that I wouldn't speak. And when I learned to speak, she made me go to school. And in school and at home, manners and rules were really important. They were pounded into me. I was lucky. All these things worked for me. Everyone worked hard to make sure that I was engaged. And they knew I was different, but not less. Now, I had a gift. I could see the world in a new way. I could see details that other people were blind to. My mother pushed me to become self-sufficient. I worked summers at my aunt's ranch. I went to boarding school and college. And those things were uncomfortable for me at first, but they helped me to open doors to new worlds.
Excuse me, please, but we want to hear everything.
Are you a scientist?
You cannot hit people.
You think you can figure it out?
Avez-vous lu la page?
A pen and a clipboard.
Think of it as a door.
Just take one knock to the head.
I don't understand why people are cruel for no
You have
reason.
a very special mind. You see the world in ways that others can't.
Miss Grandin, this is a masterpiece.
The door opened and I went through it.
Yes, you did. And I held it.
I'm Temple Grandin.
Of what you saw right now was an exceptional excerpt from the movie that discusses the life of Dr. Temple Grandin. We find it very inspirational. And there was specifically one quote that was astonishing for me, Dr. Grandin. It was different but not less. So I want to start our discussion today with this issue, different but not less, how it feels to live with autism. And of course, Stephen, you are also welcome to add with your insights.
Well, there's actually some advantages it's given me. I'm an extreme visual thinker. Everything I think about is a picture. And I really like the fact that the movie showed a lot of my design and engineering projects. See, people with autism that are fully verbal have uneven skills. You might have one that's brilliant in music, brilliant in math, brilliant in computer programming, but really bad at something else. Like I can't do algebra, but there'll be another person with autism where they would be extremely good at algebra. And autism is a very big spectrum, and it goes from people that are running major tech companies to people that can't dress themselves. But even the nonverbals can do things. I just got an email just 2 days ago, as I had suggested giving an algebra book, the old-fashioned one, lots of numbers, to a nonverbal individual, and he is doing it, took off with it. You see, you don't know what a person can do unless you expose them to things. I was exposed to art when I was a child, and it became very evident that I was very good at drawing. And that became the basis of my design business. In fact, I can show you some of my pictures. And I learned very early on, here's some of my drawings I did for the beef industry. And when people saw my work, they hired me. I learned to sell my work. You see, a brain can be more social and emotional, or a brain can be more thinking. It's a big continuum. And I mean, half the population might lean towards the more thinking. At what point do you call it autism? And I find, you know, things with construction, engineering, animal behavior, really, really interesting things. And these are things that can turn into careers. And when I was 3, I looked very severe. Same thing with Stephen. He was little baby. He was very severe. And I had very good early education. And you can take a kid that looks very severe and learn how to talk. And then there'll be some that will not learn how to talk. But they still could be things that they could be good at. There are several nonverbal individuals with autism that make bakery goods. And people really appreciate their good baking. That was something they could do, and they could do very well. See, that needs to be the emphasis on what the person can do, rather than trying to teach me algebra, which is just impossible. But to be somebody else where you give them the algebra and they'll go to calculus and all the higher math. Each one is different.
Well, definitely there is a room for everyone. And each one of the people with autism have a place in our society, and they can thrive. They can live productive lives, whether verbal or non-verbal. It's just the need to find the right approach to address their strengths and give them a way that they can express what they are best at.
The other thing I want to emphasize is that individual had to be exposed to that math book in order to find out that he could do the algebra. And this is why it's so important. Expose children to a lot of things. Stephen's going to talk about fixing bicycles in his bicycle repair business. He was exposed to bicycles. Kids need to be exposed to tools. Kids need to be exposed to computer programming. You see, you won't know what they can do if you don't expose them to different things and see what they're like. I had music lessons. That was not for me. But somebody else, given musical instruments, they'd be good at music. A lot of kids today are playing too many video games and not getting exposed to enough things. In fact, this is my book on my projects when I was a child, my parachutes and airplane and bird kite projects. I spent hours making with those things. And you know, now they're playing video games and they're not becoming video game designers. We've got to get kids out doing all kinds of things. I did sewing when I was in primary school. Loved sewing, loved woodworking, loved art.
And Stephen.
I'm muted. Oh, Temple is absolutely right. In that autistic, it's a combination of observing autistic people. So for example, at age 4, my parents found me taking apart watches with a sharp knife. And instead of focusing on the deficits and disorder and disability, they focused on the ability. And soon they provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and put back together again. And even at age 4, maybe at that time it looked like that maybe I could be a watchmaker or a watch repairman. I would have needed a lot of support in communication and all the things required in terms of living as an adult. But at least that was something I could do. So it's a combination of observing and then exposing. So I was exposed to music. I was exposed to bicycles. And they just clicked with me. And that's why music is such a big part of my life. That's why I give music lessons to autistic children. And that is how I became, that is how I was able to build bicycles up from the ground up. from the ball bearings and spokes and putting it all together, and eventually earning money. And that's another beginning in middle school, fixing bicycles, doing a paper route. And that's something that Temple's going to talk about in terms of employment. It's important for the autistic person to have a job outside of the house, doing something.
We will cover the topic about employment transition as we move ahead.
Okay.
What I would like to invite everyone is to attend our second video, which is an excerpt from your TEDx talk. And you give a little bit more insight about from your personal experiences. It's also another thing we really loved about.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire, messages that forge brighter...
I apologize for that.
So what brings me to you? Well, let's take it from the beginning. Things were pretty typical at first. At 24 hours of age, my wife says I looked like an egg. And then at 18 months, like what happens to about 20 or 30% of us on the autism spectrum, the regressive autism bomb exploded. There was a loss of functional communication, meltdowns, withdrawal from the environment, and in brief, I became a pretty severely affected child on the autism spectrum. There was so little known about autism. It took my parents an entire year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, the doctor said they had never seen a child who was so sick, and they recommended institutionalization to a place like Willowbrook. Well, in some ways, the doctors were right about the institutionalization, and I am now in an institution of higher education right here at Adelphi University. So getting back to my situation, my parents, like we see so many parents today, they advocated on my behalf. They convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program emphasizing music, movement, sensory integration, narration, imitation, play-based therapy, therapies such as the Miller method, floor time, daily life therapy. This is terminology that we have today. In those days, the concept of early intervention did not even exist. It was parents struggling to reach their child. So what did they do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them. It didn't work. Even though imitation is a time-honored educational approach, many of us on the autism spectrum may be at a point where we're just unable to imitate. So then they flipped it around and they imitated me. And once I did that, I became aware of them in my environment. And they were able to pull me along. And I believe the key implication is, be it education, be it employment, be it friendship, be it involvement in the community, is that you first have to establish a trusting relationship with the individual. Then you can move on. And moving on, my parents understanding intuitively what I needed, appreciating what I needed, came into my lives, then they were able to bring me into theirs. With the work that my parents did, speech began to return at age 4. I got reevaluated by the school.
That was a very powerful talk, Stephen. And I'm gonna start this part of our discussion using one of your quotes. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And I want to invite you first to share your insights on the importance of awareness and acceptance for the person, the family, and the community at large.
Yes. Awareness, and we've been working at awareness, national and international organizations, be it the Qatar Foundation, be it Autism Speaks, be it Autism Society of America. We've been working on awareness for the past generation, to where we originally thought autism was a rare psychiatric disorder caused by poor parenting, and had an incidence rate of about 1 in 10,000, to now where we recognize autism as more of a different and not necessarily disordered way of being. And we now, in society, we're now much better at recognizing autism when it occurs at home, in education, in the community, and employment, to the point where the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States recognizes that 1 in 54 people, the prevalence rate is 1 in 54. And that's a lot of autism. And what this awareness does is it builds a solid foundation for the next step, which is acceptance. And what I mean by acceptance is that as we become aware of autistic characteristics, we also realize that we can't change these core characteristics, but we can work with these characteristics. So it's a turning away from working against the characteristics, attempting to make the autistic person a poor imitation of a non-autistic person, but instead helping that autistic person be the best autistic person they can be. So what if, for example, Temple's mother insisted that Temple become social and become a social butterfly? Now, a certain amount of social interaction is important. And as Temple said, that was pounded into her. And likewise with my parents, there were just certain things that I needed to learn. Sitting at the dinner table, not grabbing food, but asking for it to be passed. Not asking for seconds until everybody else has had their firsts. These are things we had to learn. But neither of us are going to be social butterflies in a noisy bar, for example. And knowing that, we work with the characteristics and realize that we can still lead fulfilling and productive lives, not going into these noisy establishments, and concentrating on our areas of strength, of ability. One of mine being mechanical, taking apart watches, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, which was later transferred to bicycles. With Temple, her art. And at the same time, stretching. That's a term that Temple uses a lot too. Stretching the person. So with Temple, she was interested in drawing horse heads. Her mother encouraged her to expand into drawing the entire horse, or maybe including the stable as well. For me, expanding from taking apart watches to taking apart radios and other electronic and mechanical equipment, and expanding to bicycles. So that is what I think about when we talk about acceptance, working with. And another example, a common school example might be, say we have an autistic child who's reluctant to do math. Maybe they're not good at it, whatever it is, they're reluctant to do it. So we do an interest inventory, and we realize that a special interest for that child is using a flight simulator on a computer. They live to do that. They would do it all day if you let them do it. And commonly what would happen is that we'd set up a program where if the child does what they need to do in math for the first 20 minutes, they earn 10 minutes on the flight simulator as a motivator. But still, that's kind of working against the characteristics of autism. Working with the characteristics would be to take that flight simulator and use it to teach math. There's a lot of mathematics involved in flying airplanes. So let's find a way to take those interests and use them directly for educating the autistic child in this case. And when we get to the diversity, Temple talks about autism being an extremely wide spectrum, ranging from some autistic people running companies to others who cannot dress themselves. I think the diversity of autism of autistic people, it may even be greater than the diversity outside the autism spectrum. Temple and I were very different people. And also what is important to realize is that there are things we can include autistic people throughout the autism spectrum. So I know many people on the spectrum who are more significantly affected. They need a lot of support in terms of communication, social interaction, transportation, even managing their daily schedule. But when provided the proper support, as Temple mentioned, they could be baking goods in a bakery. They could be working in a laundromat. They could be doing something else that emphasizes their interests and their skills. So that is why we need to turn away from looking at autism as a series of deficits, disorder, and disability, and look at autism as a collection of ability. Now that said, it's also important to realize that there are many challenges that come with autism. Both Temple and I had many challenges as a child, and we needed a lot of intervention and a lot of education to work through those challenges. So we cannot deny the challenges and the disabling aspects of autism. But at the same time, we need to focus on the abilities and the strengths.
I want to look back to the importance of acceptance, because a lot of families, a lot of people, neurodiverse people, are dealing with rejection. So how we can encourage the overall acceptance in the society. For example, there are parents who are going to a shopping mall or outside to visit others, and then there is a meltdown in between. That creates a lot of tensions. It also makes the social skills of the person really poor. So how we can encourage the acceptance, which I think is based on awareness?
Well, I think part of it is supporting the autistic person. So let us say we have an autistic person who fails the Walmart test. And what that is you bring an autistic child into Walmart, they get sensorially overloaded and they have a full-blown meltdown and everything breaks down and the parents have to leave. So let's work with the child, understand the sensory issues, that they exist and they are significant. And we could come up with a plan. Maybe we could start out with, we're going to go to Walmart, but we're going to get one thing. We're going to get a bottle of milk and then we're leaving. And we're not going to change our mind either. Oh, I suddenly need to get something else. And you're going to prepare the child and perhaps even provide the child with some sort of ear protection, say headphones. And if the child needs to wear those headphones in that specific situation, then sure, they can wear it, but not all the time, because what will happen is the brain will habituate to the lessened amount of sound and the hearing sensitivity could even become more extreme.
I just want to make another comment. Okay, yes. Now Walmart's something where you work with giving the kids some idea of control of how much time he's in this large, great big store. Other kinds of sounds the child could control, like a vacuum cleaner or a hairdryer. And in those situations, the thing to do is to let the kid play with the vacuum cleaner or the hairdryer, where they turn it on and off, where they control that sound. And that can often help them to tolerate it better. Or in Walmart, when I put my hand up like this, I'll take you out of Walmart. In other words, give them a sense of control over the stimulation. And sometimes that can help desensitize it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that sense of control. And maybe you could even provide a forced choice to the child. We are going to Walmart today. Should we get a bottle of milk or should we get cookies? And just do that one thing that that child suggests. Of course, the adult realizes that they need to get both. So getting either one is fine, and then they'll have to get the other one at a later point when the child...
Or we're going to go to Walmart and we're going to get something that maybe the child wants. If you have a meltdown in Walmart, then you're not going to get the toy you could buy at Walmart.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe gradually increase the amount of time. Start going to Walmart when it's not busy, and you gradually increase it You know, there's a lot of things to buy in Walmart, and you know, from a candy bar to something more expensive. But it's important to give the child some sense of control. You're not just shoving them into a super busy Walmart and just throwing them into it, because that's going to cause a meltdown.
Exactly. Especially if you don't indicate the amount of time you're going to spend in Walmart. As a child, I used to hate to go clothes shopping because it seemed to last forever. We'd have to try on clothes, they wouldn't fit, take them off, try on other clothes, and I never knew it was going to end. And that would create a lot of anxiety in me. Also, new clothes have this horrible smell, which I only found out later as an adult, because clothes are cured with formaldehyde to keep the colors from running. And that is what I smell when I go into a department store, and that's just something I'm very, very sensitive.
All clothing that goes against my skin gets washed before I wear it. All underwear, t-shirts, anything that goes against the skin, a pair of pants, they're washed before I wear them. Now, obviously, I don't wash a jacket, but the things that go against my skin, I wash. And we got some new masks over at school. I think I'm going to have to wash this mask. It's really nice. They got our school logo on it. I'm going to have to wash this mask before I can really wear it.
So from what I hear from both of you, first, structure is very important to support the person. And it will also help the family in their social interactions, and also the power of choice, giving control over certain situations to the person.
Yeah, that's right. And limited choice, you know, but choice.
Right.
And just in case somebody doesn't know what Walmart is, it's a great big, gigantic, huge store in the US that sells everything.
And
somebody doesn't know what it is.
We have so many things to discuss. So one of the things, the next things that I wanted to hear from you is about transitions, life skills, and job opportunities for neurodiverse people. So how we can support the transition, how we can build more skills for young neurodiverse people.
I'm sorry about interrupting. One of my problems is I have a real slow processor speed. I was a computer. I'm only an Intel 286 with a computer geek, but I've got the cloud and a warehouse full of servers for memory. And I have problems with the timing. I still have that problem. And one of the big problems I'm seeing right now is not teaching enough life skills. I'm seeing smart kids on the autism spectrum, teenagers who have never gone shopping. They haven't learned how to handle money. These were things that I was taught at a very, very young age. And then how about job skills? They're different than academic skills. Chores at home, helping clean the house, things like that. The paper routes are gone. We no longer have children delivering newspapers. So we're going to need to find other things they can do for jobs, like maybe go to the mosque and they've got a volunteer job there's a certain time each week where they've got to help out with things where it's on a schedule outside the home. When I was 13, a mother set up a little sewing job for me just in the neighborhood. There was a lady that did dressmaking and seamstress in her home. And I took apart garments and I hand sewed them. Those kinds of things easy to do in the community. I was cleaning horse stalls. You could a child could help out in the market selling things, but learning work skills. So we're making a gradual transition. So when it's time for them to get a job, it's not a big surprise. Now in the US, you have to be 16 before you can work in the regular economy, like in a store. When they're 16, they need to get a real job. Now we need to be careful about multitasking. There are some jobs that would be very bad. A very busy takeout window would be a bad job. A store jam-packed during the holidays, bad job. Let's start out with jobs where they can do them. The other thing is, bosses cannot be vague. I mean, even now, I need clear instructions. There's a big veterinary conference coming up in June. I'm doing 4 talks there. And I got all these complicated papers, and I finally called the organizer. I said, okay, now what do you want me to do? I need clear instructions. I want the title of my talk, a 2-sentence description of the talk, and 10 multiple choice questions for continuing education about the talk. And that's, they want that for all 4 talks. Okay, now you have told me exactly what you want me to do. And when this conference is over, I have to go do this. So even now, I need clear instructions, not vague instructions. I didn't know whether I was supposed to do it for one talk, and I had 3 different organizers contacting me. Oh, I called up the head organizer, and then I asked him, all right, now, this is what you want me to do. I will get it done today. Very clear. Vagueness does not work. Just doesn't work with me. And I like things where it's a clear project. You know, even when I was designing really big construction projects, I want to know, how many cattle you want to put in this yard? Is a piece of land next door, can I design on it? I want very specific, I'll do the designing, but I want very specific outcomes, not vague, and then I'll just go and do it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's important to be very specific in terms
of course, in your bicycle repair business, yeah, you know what the goal is. You fix the bike.
Yeah,
that's something that's very clear.
Right. Yeah, I'd be told put together these 5 bikes. Okay, I'll assemble the bicycles. Figure out what's wrong with this bicycle. I could figure that out pretty quickly. Build a bicycle wheel. Okay, I'll take the hub, the spokes, and the rim and put it all together. And suddenly there is a bicycle wheel. Now, as Temple said, busy multitasking type of situations are not good for us. I remember my first formal job was working in a busy restaurant cleaning tables. And it was just a basket full of sensory violations, way too much social interaction to boot, which made me realize that I needed to find something that I was good at, that used my skills, something I was interested in and had much less sensory input, even though I didn't have the language that we use today in terms of sensory input, but I just knew I needed a quieter place. So I got on my bicycle that I built from the ground up, and I rode to about a dozen bicycle shops in my area. And I'd go into the shop, I'd find the manager, and then with that manager, I would nerd into my bicycle, and we'd talk about bicycles and components and all kinds of other things that only a bicycle geek would understand. And then after a period of time, I would ask him for a job. And what I realized, it took about 12 times, but then I got a job. And there I was fixing bicycles in the back of the shop, controlling my sensory input, or I could come out to the front, talk to people who walked in and perseverate about bicycles. However, I think the supervisor framed that as selling bicycles. And what I realized that I did only much later is that I used the portfolio method of selling my work. So in other words, talking about my work, which I could do very easily, and Temple certainly can do as well, and sidestepping all of the unspoken rules and formal rules of interviewing, making a certain type of eye contact, shaking the person's hand. How hard do you hold that person's hand? How many times do you pump that person's hand? And we can all learn this. But if we're so busy thinking about those things, then how much is left to talk about the job? So by the time I got to asking for a job as a bicycle mechanic, the supervisor already knew that I knew my way around a bicycle, and that I would probably be a good bicycle mechanic. So one of them took the risk, and it worked out very well.
I want to make a comment. Another thing that I cannot handle is long strings of verbal information. I cannot remember it. Okay, when I talked to the head of the veterinary conference this morning, I wrote down, you want the title of this talk, a 2-sentence description, 5 multiple choice questions, and then you want that for all 4 talks, and I wrote down. But if someone were, let's say, I'd be very good at things like cleaning and fixing, let's say, the McDonald's ice cream machine. But where I'd get into a problem is the boss says, well, this is how you take it apart and do it. And he just tells me verbally, I cannot remember the sequence. I would need to write down the steps, give myself a pilot's checklist of the 6 steps to take the ice cream machine apart, the steps to clean the ice cream machine, and the steps to put it back together. Pilot's checklist. Sort of key words to jog my memory. That's all I need to have, because a long, complicated verbal description, I cannot remember it.
And I'm the same as Temple. Long strings of information don't work, but having a checklist, a pilot's checklist, as you talked about that would be very helpful. And let us suppose there's a complicated set of procedures to, say, run a machine in a place of work. Why not just take that pilot's checklist and put it on the wall, make a big poster of it. And in that way, in addition to the autistic person being able to access this information, it's helpful to everybody else as well.
That's right.
And what I find is that when I work with supervisors in places of employment, a common comment that I get is the supervisor tells me, you know, all of this work that I've spent on focusing my communication and being able to better communicate and supervise autistic people in the workplace has made me a better supervisor overall, a better manager overall. And what this suggests is that as we think about modifications that we make to the workplace for autistic individuals, it actually ends up making the place better for everybody else.
These are really great points, and thank you for giving us your advice on that. And that creates also a nice bridge with the issue of employment. So how we can encourage employers to engage more people within the autism spectrum.
Well, I think one of the things to do is just like Stephen was talking about portfolios. I designed all the animal handling for every some of our biggest beef plants in this country. I designed the entire front end of that plant, steel and concrete construction, machinery design. And when I was out looking for jobs, I simply showed a portfolio, pictures and drawings. The other thing I did is I learned good writing skills when I was in high school. And I would write about my projects in the industry trade magazines. And people would read that. A lot of pictures with those articles. Again, it gets back to selling work. And I worked with a lot of very skilled people on big construction projects. And I'm going to estimate that about 20% of highly skilled welders, people that own companies that build complicated specialized metal work, were either autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. And what's happening to those kids today is they may have an autism diagnosis, they're addicted to video games, and I'm seeing too many kids growing up today that never use tools. And I have to watch the removal of that ship from the Suez Canal. These tugboats had to work coordinated. They need to be getting credit for this. And I will bet you there was some autism involved in getting that ship out of the Suez Canal. I've worked 25 years in heavy construction and worked with some brilliant people that I know today would be diagnosed on the autism spectrum.
And that's right, there is a lot of autism in the workplace already. For example, there are many professors at universities who are autistic. I just happen to recognize that I am autistic and I'm open with it. But I'm thinking about some of my colleagues who don't realize they're on the spectrum, but they are.
Well, I had a math teacher. There was a math teacher at my college that I think was definitely autistic. And I have been out to the large tech companies, kind of companies that bring you the technology that we're using right now. All our major big American tech companies, I've been at the corporate offices, and there are programmers there that I know are autistic. undiagnosed. Another thing is, when I talk about grandfathers and grandmothers come up to me at meetings and they discover they're on the autism spectrum when the kids are diagnosed. Now, these are grandfathers that probably either had no speech delay, they'd be the Asperger type, or they had just a mild speech delay. And they have good jobs, like NASA Space Scientist was one of them. It's at a Houston conference. And he had a paper route when he was 11. You see, this goes back to learning work skills at a young age. This is something that's very important because in these old, my generation paper routes, you had to go find the customers, then you had to make sure you deliver them every day, and then you had to collect the payment for the papers. So it was like, it really taught great skills, and that's gone now. And see, this is the problem you have with autism, is this big spectrum. You got the same name on somebody that might be running, actually the president of one of our big tech companies, to somebody that can't dress themselves. Another thing that people with autism are really good at is attention to detail. We just had a big mess in a vaccine factory where they mixed two different vaccines together in the factory. Yeah, and it's now getting straightened out. Very bad mistake. That's where you need somebody to make sure that those sort of things don't happen. Now, there's three specialized kinds of minds in autism. You have the picture thinker like me. I'm what's called an object visualizer. I describe that. Here's my book, The Way I See It. My most basic book on autism, The Way I See It. A lot of little short articles. And I think in pictures. The HBO movie showed how I think in pictures. And then you have the more mathematical mind, where they think more in patterns. And a job where a lot of these can get is computer programming. But somebody's got to introduce them to computer programming, otherwise they can't learn it. Then you have the word thinker. And they're very good at, specialized knowledge about specialized things. They'd be a good person having that vaccine factory to make sure that they're following procedures. This is a stupid mistake. They mixed the ingredients of two different vaccines together. They threw away millions of doses of vaccine. And now they've gone in and the factory's got totally new management now.
Yeah, 15 million to be specific.
It was disgusting. And yeah. They mixed Johnson & Johnson ingredients with AstraZeneca ingredients. I mean, I work in the food industry. This is the most basic mistake. Well, one thing they should have done is labeled the ingredients and put them in separate places. We do that in the cattle industry because we have our regular cattle and then we have our organic cattle. And the things the organic cattle are not allowed to have, we put somewhere away from them. It's a very basic thing in manufacturing. And this is where you need somebody who's a little bit autistic to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen.
Absolutely. And I think one important thing to keep in mind about autism is that we're a study of extremes. And what that suggests is that the things we're good at, we're incredibly good at. And for example, focus to detail, visual thinking and processing. For others, you may have some who are auditory processors, or some people who are more kinesthetic in nature and learn by doing. The difference is that with non-autistic people, even if you consider your weakest modality, so suppose you say, I'm a visual learner and I learn better when I see pictures, the auditory system works well enough to get you through school, to get you through your daily lives. But for the autistic person, we'll be to an extreme and may be the best visual learner or thinker in the entire room or in the entire area. But when it comes to auditory processing, it may be practically non-functional or even non-functional at all.
Well, so, I cannot hear, if I'm in a noisy environment, like a real noisy restaurant, I'm functionally deaf. I cannot hear. Yeah. Now, a question just came up here on the chat, a very abstract question that I actually do not understand. because it's too abstract. I understand factories, I understand cattle, I understand ships stuck in the canal. First of all, those are things I can visualize. Can you please try to seek and raise some issues related to the contextualization of the discussion? I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know what that question means. Could you tell me?
We need specifics, examples.
Yes.
I think it's we can talk for very long about specific issues, but we are running out of time, and I want to give the opportunity also to address the questions from the audience. So I want to get your perspectives on one last point, which is about the challenges and opportunities in the post-pandemic world. This is obviously a huge topic. We're still under the pandemic. So what would be your recommendation or your views specifically on inclusion in the workplace?
Well, let's put an autistic person in charge of the vaccine factory.
Yeah,
that's one thing I would do. Because we've got the fact, I've been studying the pandemic very closely. There's only one way out. We've got to vaccinate everybody. That's what we got to do. We got to do it before the variants outrun us, which means I just looked up 2 new variants that just started in the United States. I think our vaccines are still going to work. See, the other thing is I'm very project oriented. It's not, there's nothing abstract about it. I've worked 25 years in construction. You design projects, you supervise construction, you get them done. Or the tugboats got the ship unstuck and got it out of the canal. You see, that's finishing a project. That's the kind of stuff I'm good at. And I don't, verbal thinkers, regular, normal, verbal, social thinkers are way too vague. And like that question right there was an example. I don't even know what that question means. Or parents will come to me and say, or teachers say, how do I teach autistic kids? Well, if they're 3, I can give you standard talk about early intervention. Don't wait many hours of one-to-one teaching, turn taking, teaching speech. You got to wait for the kid to respond because they're slow, speak slowly. But when they get older, I have to have a lot more information. And I find the same thing with animal behavior questions. Overgeneralization. My dog, they'll say, well, my horse is crazy. Well, what did it do? I can't even answer that.
Yeah, and like with the students, you're right.
But I'm into projects. Okay, like when I get done with this conference, I've got to write up this stuff for this veterinary conference. And now I know exactly what they want. It's clear now, but I had to do a phone call to find that out.
Yeah, you need specifics. And when you're in a school situation, for example, if I get asked a question, how do I teach this autistic child? They misbehave in class. So what do you mean by misbehave? What are some specific things they're doing? Oh, the child is getting up and playing with the light switch. Oh, okay, this is something I can work with. The child gets up and pokes their classmate. Oh, this is something I can work with. The child rips up their math paper. This is something specific and I can work with. And likewise for employment. When I had my paper route, there were very specific things I had to do. Whenever it snowed and school was closed for the day, I had some very specific ideas as to what would be done. I'd go outside with a shovel and I'd shovel neighbors' driveways, and it'll be a great way to earn money. And an example of a job outside of the house that I did on my own. So Temple, you're absolutely right. We need specifics, specific examples.
Another question I get asked all the time is, how can I figure out what my kid's good at? First of all, it usually does not show up at age 3. My art ability really showed up more like 7 and 8 years old. Again, I was exposed to art materials. I was also exposed to musical instruments. I was not, I was not one of the musical kids, but another kid would pick this little flute, would have picked it up and would have started playing. Or you expose your kid to some mathematics stuff, whatever, different things, tools, a whole bunch of things. But if you expose them to enough stuff and you keep them off the video games, you'll start to see what they're good at. But I'm saying too many kids today aren't exposed to enough different things. There have been 3 adults that were badly addicted to video games, with my kind of picture thinking, and they were weaned off and went into car mechanics. And one of them is now fixing trains for the railroad, and they love him. Or another one might be doing programming for a tech company. Okay, now the pandemic, let's discuss how I dealt with that. I get home from my last airplane trip. I walk into a faculty meeting. This was a year ago in March, and they shut down the university, and I had to get my classes online. Okay, it was clear. I called up my computer guy, Chris, thank you. He goes over to the electronics store. He had found that in their storeroom, there was a really nice mic they didn't know they had. It's a really big studio kind of mic, looks like a robot. Well, he went back in their storeroom and bought it. But I knew what we had to do. We had to get these classes online, and we had 10 days to do it. The other thing, but that's a clear goal. And I take my class, my cattle behavior class, really seriously, and I worked really hard to make a good class online. It's a lot more work than an in-person class, a lot more work to do the discussion board decently. That's a clear goal. The other thing I did for the pandemic is every day, get up, get dressed, get showered, ready for work by 7:30. Every single morning, dress for work. No laying around in jammies. And then I'm going, I got to have other things to do. So every time I had a chance to book a Zoom call, I'd book them. And one good thing that's come out of the pandemic is I'm getting to talk to you. Steve and I are doing so many more international conferences now. And this is good. And I want to get back and do some travel, but I don't think I'm going to be doing as much travel. I'm going to do maybe 1/3 of the travel I was doing before.
And similarly with me, when we got kicked off of campus, I believe on March 8th.
Also it was March 12th.
Okay, and I got into, I knew that they said, oh, we're going to be back in 10 days or so. Mm-hmm. And I knew that wasn't going to happen. So I packed up all of my goods, everything that I had near my university in New York. I put them in my car and I drove home to Boston because that's actually where I live. My house is there, my wife is there, her work is there. I drove home. I knew I was going to be home for a while. And that's exactly what happened. Fortunately, I'd already started using Zoom, and it's a similar type of software to teach online. So it wasn't that difficult for me to transition to all online. But what I realized that I needed to do was to enforce a schedule, enforce a routine. So Temple is up at 7:30, I'm up at 7 o'clock. And I also, and I have to get dressed for work like I'm doing now, not just kind of laying around. Also, we need to be much more mindful of movement. We need to move, or at least I need to move. So pre-pandemic, I was getting a lot of incidental exercise. I would ride my bicycle to school. I would walk from one office to another to talk with colleagues. Whatever it was, there's a lot of movement. Now, my movement just consisted of, or intentional movement, consisted of walking from the bedroom to an office at home and doing my work. So that meant that every other day, I needed to get on my elliptical bike and spin that elliptical bike for 90 minutes every other day to get my necessary exercise and movement. And that is important for both autistic people and for everybody else.
Well, I did the same thing. The other thing I did is I very quickly figured out that the pandemic was airborne after I heard about the cruise ship and prisons and an aircraft carrier getting an instant infection. It was airborne. I knew that way before it was officially announced. So I very carefully met with my students outside in a little enclosure we call a gazebo. I had 2 people that I interacted with. I had to do some interaction. Our meat facility was open at school because it was considered essential. I'd go over there and I was extremely careful because I had to have some things to do. You know, okay, we'd have lunch at this time, then I'd have my students, we'd have lunch outdoors, you know, socially distanced, and have some schedule there. And I'm vaccinated now. I can tell you, I got that second shot. It was like freedom. I booked a flight the next day, and 3 weeks later, when Pfizer was fully, done everything it was going to do, went on my first flight.
Yeah, that's right, Temple.
This is really important. I want to give the opportunity also to address some of the questions. There are so many questions, interesting questions that everyone wants you to, to tackle.
Well, let's address this question here about children during the pandemic and online. First of all, young autistic kids, like 3-year-olds, you cannot teach online. That's not going to work. Now, what can be done online is for a therapist to watch a parent teaching the child and coach. Now, a lot of moms with a 3-year-old are going to get too overstressed trying to do that. You've got to get some volunteers to come in and help with this 3-year-old that's nonverbal that you're trying to do early intervention. Now, with the older kids, it ranges from adapting really well to awful. It's very variable. Well, we still need to get kids out doing things. I have another new book called The Outdoor Scientist. And it's just getting outside and observing the stars. When I was a child, my sister and I had a rock collection. We'd bust open rocks to see what they look like. And you have to wear safety goggles for this. But just fun stuff they can do outside. And they can do that during the pandemic. Observe birds, for example. It's another thing they could do. One thing that people did here, and nobody got sick, we have a river and it gets very hot in summertime and people would go swim in the river and nobody got sick doing that. And then when we got into winter, of course, couldn't do that. But finding things to do again and some kind of a schedule, but there's a problem. I've talked to regular education teachers, one second grade, that would be a 7-year-old child, primary school teacher, regular school, told me that half her kids had stopped tuning in, were not logging on to the conferences. With some of these younger kids, it's a big problem, a really big problem. We've got to get vaccinated, get teachers vaccinated, and especially these younger kids, getting them back in school. And
yeah, vaccines are the way. And there are some people who are not don't want to take the vaccines. They're afraid of the vaccines, and the vaccines are very safe, and that's all we have, and we're lucky to have them. Like Temple, I got my second Pfizer dose, and I booked a flight to the Grand Canyon. That's going to be my first autism activity post-pandemic.
Well, I did a trip. I had one speaking engagement on March that was not canceled. And I told them I'd do it in person if I had both of my shots, and I'd had 3 weeks after my second Pfizer. It was exactly
Right.
3 weeks. So I did that speaking engagement. I've got one in Texas that was not canceled. And I've got some industrial visits. I'm really looking forward to getting out in the factories again. Really looking forward to that. And I got a fun trip going to a poultry plant. It's going to be a lot of fun, brand new poultry plant. Really looking forward to that. That's going to be like the pleasure trip. But there was no way. I'm 73 years old, and age is a definite risk factor. And there was no way I was going to travel until I was vaccinated, except for my small circle of people that I interacted with.
Yeah, that was the same way.
The social bubble, yeah.
Yeah, I had a social bubble. I did. We had to, and we met outside. And when I went over to our meat facility, I was very careful. I just stayed in the room. I stayed in this one part where I was about the only person in there.
If it's okay, because I want to cover as many questions as possible. to go to the next one. So how we can support better diagnosis of autism in girls and women, because it often goes under the radar.
Well, I think it's important to, one, to recognize that at this point, a lot of autism is being missed in females. And part of the reason is that autism shows up a little bit differently in females. And most research is done on males. So that means we need more research on what does autism look like in females. Secondly, females tend to be a little bit better in terms of social interaction and imitation, so that they can cover, they can self-accommodate. Third, it has to do with societal expectations. Now, at least I know in the United States, if we have a female, be it a student, or be an older adult, even someone like Temple. And Temple isn't this way, but let us suppose Temple was. And this is the female perhaps who's sitting in the corner, reading, doing their own thing, not making eye contact, not interacting with others. What do we say? We say that the female is shy and we move on. But
well, these may be also maybe girls that don't have speech delay. I had severe speech delay until I was 4. So it was very obvious that I had something wrong with me. But these would be kids where these girls would be probably no speech delay or just a very small amount of speech delay.
Right. I know many female
severe speech delay is going to get picked up.
Oh yeah, that will. Yeah. I know many females whose lives were just a total mess and disaster for just about every single vector, whether it was relationships, employment, education. And these were highly verbal and very intelligent females, but they had this alphabet soup of misdiagnoses. And only when they found out that it was really autism, and often in middle age, possibly even older, then things started to make a lot more sense. They'd get off this cocktail of medications that they were being medicated for things that they didn't have. So that was causing problems as well.
Well, this book right here, Different Not Less, is, I edited this book, and it's 18 adults, all employed, different types of jobs, from tech jobs to tour guide. And they write in their own words their experience with as a child, with education, and their experiences with relationships. And they were diagnosed later in life. And where the diagnosis helped them later in life was with their relationships. Then I had a wife of an engineer come up to me at the airport one time. She said, well, your book helped me understand my engineer husband, saved our marriage. Understanding why he is the way he is.
So picking up on this point, there's another question. Is there anything we can do to help an autistic person become less rigid and more able to cope with change?
Yes. Yes. Okay, one of the problems is black and white thinking about good and bad. Well, the autistic mind categorizes. Well, if you get a lot of information, I could make different degrees of good and bad. Killing somebody is worse than robbing a bank. But robbing a bank is worse than stealing fruit from the supermarket. You see, you can make degrees, of badness. That's why in the US we have felonies and we have misdemeanors. That's how we classify crimes, sort of minor and major crimes. You see, and as you give them more information on that, then you can rank different bad things by sort of degrees of badness. And stealing a single apple from the supermarket is not the same as killing somebody, which is way, way, way worse. And it's taught by specific example. But in order to learn that flexibility, you have to put a lot of data in the database. It's like it's bottom-up thinking. You have to load the database. Right. I can remember when the internet first started, there wasn't much on it.
And similarly, along with that, is the concept of introducing small measured amounts of disorder. And from that, I look towards the Miller method. Because so often we focus on autistic people needing everything to be absolutely predictable and scheduled, and they know what's coming next. And of course, that's good. But we know that the world is inherently chaotic. So what we need to do is provide some preparation for and support for an autistic person. So for example, you might have someone who's really significantly affected, and they might go into a meltdown, walking into their classroom, finding a chair that has not been pushed into place. It's out of place. Or maybe even it's on its side, it's on the floor. And that could cause a meltdown. And what we would need to do is teach that child that they have the capacity, they have the power to modify their environment and pick that chair up and put it exactly where it belongs. So that might be a mild example of disorder. Or it might be preparing the child who melts down if the parent doesn't drive home the same way every single time. No, we're going to go a different way. And preparing that child, and we're going to take a small detour. Because I know of a number of autistic people who will have a meltdown if they have to go a different route between home and school, for example.
I remember when I was a child looking up at the ceiling of my bedroom, and I was a young child, maybe 6, and there was a water stain on the ceiling because the roof had leaked. And I got terrified that the ceiling was going to come down and that the furniture from the room above me would go into my room. I visualized that, even though I know that now, than what I know about construction, the part of the ceiling could come down, but the furniture would stay.
Right.
But I saw this water stain and I'm going, well, what if the whole thing just broke? Well, in that situation, someone needs to explain to me that there's no way the furniture from upstairs, from the floor above, is going to come through the ceiling because there's a watermark on the ceiling.
Right, and probably show a diagram of the supporting rafters and studs.
Well, there's a big wooden frame that I didn't know existed.
Right, and you can
between that. Right. That's going to keep the bed and the TV and the stuff that was upstairs.
Upstairs, right?
Yeah, it was in the room above me from crashing down into my room.
Yeah, and that would have helped a lot.
Well, I didn't know about the rafters.
Right. Yeah, you needed to be told, that's all.
I have to be told, that's right.
Right.
I want to take the opportunity to, because of the time, we're already 15 minutes past, but I want to give as much, space for the questions to be answered. So first of all, I see if we see a child that chooses to be mute and avoid communication, how can we know if this is the case?
Well, let's talk about the kids that don't talk. And some of these kids that never learn to talk can learn to type independently. And you find out they actually have an active mind inside. And a simple thing for them to type on is simply a tablet computer set for text messaging. You don't have to send the text, and the reason why that works is because the print appears next to the keyboard. So you don't have the attention shift. Like on this laptop, I got to look down here at the keyboard, and then I got to look up. And a lot of people can't make the attention shift. But there's books such as Tito Makapadahe, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move? How can I talk if my lips don't move? Now, when you see Tito, he flaps, he can't control his movement. He describes extreme effort required, to do the writing. But there's a number of people now who type completely independently. And there's also a Noki, Japanese boy. There's a book called The Reason I Jump. There was a big selling book in the US. And there's a sequel to it, which I think is a better book than The Reason I Jump. It's something like fall down 5 times, get up 7 times. He describes not being able to control movement. Some nonverbals can learn to type completely independently with nobody touching them or touching the thing they type on, tablet, keyboard, or a piece of cardboard with the keyboard on it.
So what Temple is getting at is the vital importance of developing a reliable means of communication. Probably the most important thing we can do. Because if you can't communicate, then you can't do anything. And I know many autistic people who were with measured IQs of freezing temperature, room temperature, and given up as too autistic or hopeless. But somehow they've come in contact or exposed to a keyboard or some other communication device. And as Temple said, there's an active mind in there. And I know many non-speaking autistic people, and I like to use the word non-speaking rather than non-verbal, because there's a lot of other parts to verbal interaction than just talking like we're doing now. And if we say someone's non-verbal, what that's really means is that that person has no concept of what language is. And that's a very severe and significant situation. Whereas there are many autistic people who communicate in other ways and are just as intelligent as we are and could easily be in a conversation with us in today's event, but they're typing everything out, or they're communicating in a different way rather than speaking. And research also suggests that if we teach a child who's having difficulty with speaking an alternative means of communication, that if they are going to speak, it's going to come faster. And they did a research study. I heard of this research study. I've got to find the specific citation, where they took two groups of typically developing children at the pre-verbal stage. Half of them they taught sign language, the other half they didn't. The half they taught sign language began to verbally interact earlier than the ones who were not taught sign language. So
thank you, Stephen.
Communication.
Thank you so much for bringing awareness. I'm sorry I have to jump in because there are, again, so many important questions and the time is limited. So I want to address to both of you the issue about social stigma and its implication. And what would you suggest we can start doing, especially here in the Middle East, to change the culture?
I think one of the things we can do is showing off the work.
That's right.
Showing my work. When I took my drawings out and I showed them to people, I got respect. The other thing I got respect for is there's a scene in the movie where I go up to the editor of our farm magazine and I get his card. Because I knew if I wrote for this farm magazine, that would help my career. And I got respect for writing very accurate summaries of speeches at our Arizona cattle feeders meeting. But when I summarized a speech given in a meeting, it was summarized accurately. And that, again, is a showing off of work. They thought it was really weird, but I very quickly got a reputation that when I covered a meeting as a reporter, it was covered accurately. And that's something that was respected. And then when I started designing things and they got built, I'd show people my drawings, I'd show them pictures of my jobs, and I got respect for that. I think that's one of the best ways to get over stigma, is showing things you can be really good at.
Right, and also making autism part of the general conversation. So having clips on the news, showing autistic people working and engaged in the community, finding ways for people to meet autistic individuals. Maybe Temple, myself, or someone in the Arab world, somebody in Qatar who's autistic, who is working, who is out in the community. And as people become more familiar with autistic people and get to know autistic people, the stigma will reduce.
Well, and some of our best computer programmers that give us the technology we're using right now are autistic. We have hundreds of them working in our tech industry. Most of them would be where there was no speech delay when there was a child. You see, autism is a true continuous trait. We wouldn't even have this technology if it wasn't for some degrees of autism.
Another question that I find also really important to answer, because I know we have a lot of young parents in the audience, is how we can, what kind of advice or guidance we can give young parents with children with autism, so they can start their journey in supporting their children.
Well, if you got a 3-year-old that's not talking, you need to start working with them now. The worst thing you can do is to wait. We have some situations in certain, places where it's very difficult to get a diagnosis. You got to start working with this kid now if he's not talking. First thing you do is rule out deafness. You got to make sure they're not deaf and there isn't something physically wrong with their throat. And then you just got to start working with them. And of course, I like my books. I'd recommend Getting the Way I See It. But you got to get some people working with this kid. You can't just let him watch TV and play with videos all day. And one of the things you got to do is teach these little ones how to take turns. So he's spinning a coin. Well, then we're going to take turns spinning the coin. And then start teaching them words. And I have found that some teachers have the ability to work with these kids and others don't. They just know just sort of how hard to push. But the worst thing you can do with a 3-year-old that's not talking is nothing. And after you've ruled out deafness, the therapies are pretty much the same regardless of the diagnosis. Pretty much the same. Have to make sure they're not deaf.
That's right. So it's the intensive interaction. And I've done a lot of research into different approaches: ABA, TEACH, Miller method, floor time, daily life therapy, RDI, and so on. And these different approaches focus on different things to support autistic children. So there are 2 things that immediately come to mind. Number 1, you need to match the technique or the approach to the needs of the child. So one child will do better with ABA, and another child will do better with floor time or Miller method. And the second thing, getting back to what Temple was talking about, I think the greatest effect is the intensive one-on-one interaction with a knowledgeable teacher, a volunteer grandmother, somebody in the community who may not even know what autism is, but somehow they know how to interact with that individual. So meaningful interaction is really the key.
Except the meaningful interaction, some highlights from the points that we have discussed today is detail orientation. So it's very important to have a structure. It's also clear instructions. So we better give 1, 2, 3 as guiding posts to the people that we want to work with. Skills development is very much important. Building social manners and other social skills. As Temple highlighted, pounded. They need to be pounded in the child. And also in terms of sensory issues, there is another question. Why do some objects look scary to autistic children, like labels on the products, logos on the cars, etc.?
Well, there might be some, feature. I mean, I had some things where I was afraid of silly things, really silly things. And when I grew up, I used the thing I was afraid of, and there was a cement mixer truck. And I thought the drum from a cement mixer truck was going to come out from under my bed and eat me up. Now, that's just totally stupid. But when I was about 5, that was something I was afraid of. It was just ridiculous now when I look at it. And then when I was working in construction, we were using cement mixer trucks all the time, and I definitely was not afraid of them. When I was in about 8, I got really afraid of an older kid wearing a white sheet for a ghost costume for Halloween. She had a white sheet over her head and eyes cut out, and I got really afraid of her, and also I started throwing things at her. I don't know why I got so afraid of that. Now, this did not happen. This did not happen when I was older. This was when I was, 8 years old.
Yeah, it's hard to know why certain logos or whatnot might be frightening to an autistic child, or a cement mixer, for example. It might have been there was a bad experience with something that looked like this object. It also might be that the child got used to an object looking a certain way, and then there was an unexpected change in the object, either in its shape, the size, or the color, or somehow in its presentation. And as Temple talked about, measured exposure to that object of fear.
Well, I got very afraid of the water stain on the ceiling when the roof leaked. I was sure the furniture upstairs was going to fall down on top of me that was on the floor above me.
Right, and if somebody had taken the time to show you with pictures the wooden framing of a house to show that that would be impossible, and that the floor was probably about 12 inches thick and the ceiling was maybe only a ½ inch thick and had nothing to do with the integrity of the frame of the house, then you would have understood, but you needed to be shown logically.
And the worst thing that could happen is the plaster could come down, but not the furniture.
Right.
And the framework's not going to come down.
Right.
And the final question for today, as an adult now, what piece of advice would you give to your 10-year-old self?
To my 10-year-old self, well, when I was 10 years old, I was flying kites, doing lots of experiments with parachutes and little things that I made. Those were, things went fairly well for me in elementary school because my teacher in primary school explained to the other children that had a disability that was not visible, like a wheelchair. So for me, I managed to not get bullied until high school. High school was horrible, bullying, teasing. And the only places I was not bullied was friends through shared interests. I really want to emphasize that. I had a friend I rode horses with. I had a friend that I was in a model rocket club. I was in an electronics club. And the students that were interested in those things were not bullies. Friends through shared interests. It could be a Star Wars club. It could be musical instruments, a band. It could be a lot of different things. A mathematics club, robotics club. But that's going to help. That's going to help out. No, bullied. I was bullied a lot. I had a terrible time in a regular high school. That did not work. And I think some of these kids, they need to get out and just start working. They need to go from being a child to a grown up and skip all the teenage nonsense and get a job.
Yeah, there's a lot
thing to do.
Yeah, the teenage time was a bunch of nonsense for me too. Unlike Temple, I was bullied a lot in elementary school. And I think Temple's suggestion of getting involved in interests, which I did. I was interested in bicycles, meeting people through that interest, joining bicycling clubs, music being an interest, focusing on music, joining the band. Band people tend to be a little bit weird or geeky anyways, so that worked out. And as long as I stayed within those interests, things were much better socially. And it's those interests and those fascinations and skills that can lead to opportunities for successful employment.
Like that's absolutely right. But the reason I was not bullied in elementary school or primary school was because my teacher did what's now called Peer-Mediated Intervention. That's a fancy name for what my primary school teacher did, in explaining to the other children that had a disability that was not visible, like a wheelchair. And that was a really good thing that my teacher did when, in primary school. High school, big high school, disaster.
Right. And for me, by the time I got into high school, I was able to integrate into the band class. As I mentioned before, I got interested in electronics. I took an electronics class. And then there were plenty of opportunities to make friends outside of school. So even though I was the youngest member of the bicycling club, nobody made fun of me because we're all focused on things related to bicycles, either riding them or fixing them. And likewise, joining community musical ensembles.
Well, that's the same thing I had with model rockets and with riding horses. The same thing.
Well, I can't thank you enough for all the great points that you shared with us today. We're so grateful to be able to host you live with us today here in Qatar. Before we close the session, I just want to share a beautiful quote from Christopher Reeve. A hero is an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. So I think you're shining examples of this quote. We are very honored and humbled to be in your presence tonight. And we will be sharing the recording with all the participants and the people who are interested in. Again, a warm thanks on behalf of the Qatar Career Development Center and everyone who was in our company tonight. I wish we had more time. We are already 30 minutes past. I wish we had more time to address even more questions and to give space. Hopefully we will have the opportunity another time soon to connect again. And with that, I will give just, the last step to you, both Stephen and Temple, before we close.
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the potential of autistic people is unlimited. And what we need to do is figure out how to reach that potential, how to access that potential. And again, given the great diversity that we find in the autism spectrum, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one person on the spectrum.
I just want to emphasize developing strengths like my art ability and drawing ability. Mother kept expanding it, so I wasn't just drawing the same horse head over and over again. For another child, it might be math, but if you have an 8-year-old that's good at math and he's never exposed to, algebra or some of the more difficult math, he's not going to advance. You have to expose to a more advanced work, or maybe it might be music. Or it might be mechanics. Well, then you need to be exposed to tools. I think a lot of kids today just aren't exposed to enough stuff to develop an interest. I've talked to two families where both parents were in the computer industry or programmers, and they got so much stuck in the autism box, and their kid was good at math, they didn't think to teach their child programming. And I suggested that, and they go, well, that's a really good idea. We hadn't thought of that. And then he might be really good at programming. And that's something that can become a career. But you've got to expose them to it.
Absolutely. There are so many rich teaching and points for everyone to consider and take away with them today. I just want to remind everyone to kindly take the link to the post-event survey. So we do appreciate your feedback, and we want to hear more comments from your end, how we can support you, how we can also bring more opportunities around these issues. And again, my warmest thanks to both Dr. Temple Grandin, Dr. Stephen Shore. We look forward to connecting with you again. And hope everyone spends a lovely evening, lovely day at this part of the world that you are both in. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It was our pleasure.
It was great to be here today. Thank you so much.
We do appreciate it. Stay healthy and safe, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.
Thank you so much for inviting us. Really appreciate it.
And likewise, thank you.
Likewise, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Have a lovely evening to all.
Great to be here. Guess we're going to leave the meeting now.